Well, good evening, Key City Church. It is so good to be here with you guys this evening. We are so honored that you would join us on Halloween evening. So happy Halloween to everyone. Welcome back to those of you who are joining us again. For those of you who are joining for the first time, we're just so happy to have you here with us and just honored to be a part of whatever journey you are on, even if it's a small part that we get to play. We're just so happy to have you here and invite you to just make yourself comfortable, make yourself at home. If there's anything you need through the evening, please feel free to stop. Really, anybody. We'd all be happy to help you out, but we have folks that have name tag lanyards on. They'd be eager to help you and point you in the direction of whatever it is that you're looking for. If you noticed, we had a group of elementary age students singing with us during the music portion. If you didn't, that's okay too, but I just wanted to point out that we do have programs for infants through elementary age kids. So if you have kids, whether they're with you or not, and would be interested in finding out more about the program, we'd love to share more about it with you and invite you to come back the hallway all the way around. And there's an amazing team of leaders back there who'd be more than happy to answer your questions or show you around. Near you on the chairs are KC Connect cards. We are a very new church. We've only been meeting. This is our 8th week meeting, and we know how important it is to get connected when you're brand new in a community, and we want to make that as easy as possible. So those KC Connect cards are one of the ways that you can get connected and stay connected here at Key City Church. And if you want to just stay up to date on the information that we're putting out through email or on Facebook, leave us your information. You can leave your information on there and drop it off with us out in the lobby. We're not going to blast you or overwhelm you or spam you with anything. We're just going to keep you up to speed on what's going on around here. And if you drop that off with your information, we'll trade you that card for one of our Key City t-shirts for you and whoever else is in your group with you this evening. And as well, on the back of that card are options for next steps that you can take to get connected here at Key City Church, whatever feels comfortable for you. And just let us know. We just want to make that as easy as we can for you. Well, this week we are between two series. We just finished a series last Sunday. Next Sunday we're starting a brand new series. I'm excited about it, and I'm excited to share it with you guys. So I would love to see you back next Sunday as we start as a community together into a brand new series together. But this week we're between series. So what we're doing this week is we're taking advantage of this to talk about one of our core commitments as a church. And we're calling this message Brains, Blood, and Guts in honor of Halloween, because we're going to be talking about brains, blood, and guts tonight. Yeah, that's exciting. Sure, yeah. And we're excited to share this with you because, like I said, it's one of our core commitments. And if you're new here or you're just getting to know us, or you're learning about us, it is a great opportunity for you to be here and to find out what really, really matters to us, what's important to us, and why we think you, whether you agree with us or you're just sitting in or you're just listening, why we think it's something that might be worth considering for you as well. And where I want to start this evening is just with an observation, and this didn't originate with me. This is an observation that somebody shared with me that I've found incredibly useful in my life as a diagnostic to understand myself internally and understand why so often I do the things that I do and why I experience life the way that I experience it. It just made it super, super simple for me, and I'm excited to share it with you. And it's just this. It's that at any point in time, at any point in time, we are either above or below the line. I know, it didn't seem like enough, did it? It seemed like you had to go another. I get it. At any point in time, we are either above or below the line. Anytime. And when we're above the line, there we go. When we're above the line, we are in a state of trust. And a state of trust. And in a state of trust, it tends to feel like just peace or joy. It's a sense of safety and security when we're in a state of trust. We tend to feel more open. We feel more connected with the people around us. We feel safe and secure in our environment. We trust our environment. We trust the people around us. We trust ourselves and our ability to interact with our environment. We trust whatever the outcomes are going to be outcomes that are acceptable or that we can handle, whatever those outcomes are. It's just a state of trust and safety and security. And we tend to be more open. We tend to be less guarded, less defensive. We tend to be willing to make ourselves just a little bit more vulnerable when we're in a state of trust. And we've all experienced this, right? This is one of the experiences of above or below the line. We've experienced this like when we're sitting around a campfire with a bunch of really, really good friends that we know that we're just safe with and accepted by these friends. We feel like we're in a state of trust when we're just sitting on a beach, reading a book, or when you're doing something that you're really good at and you know you're really good at, and it just feels kind of like a state of flow. You know what you're doing and you love doing it. We're in a state of trust. And when we're below the line, we're in a state of fear. We're either above the line, in a state of trust, or we're in a state of fear, that there's something in our environment that we sense as a threat. That's either a threat to our physical safety, our emotional safety, our financial safety, or our ability to manage outcomes the way that we want those outcomes to go. There's something in our environment that feels like some kind of a threat to us. And when we're in a state of fear, we experience that. We feel more closed. We feel more defensive. We feel more protective. We feel more guarded. We feel more reactive to our environment and the people around us when we're in a state of fear. And 100% of the time, we tend to be in one of these states or the other. We tend to either be above the line or below the line. And we know this. We felt this, right? We felt trust, like we said. We felt fear, too. We know what that feels like. I mean, it could be anything from, that noise that wakes you up in the middle of the night that sounds like somebody's coming in, to politics came up at Thanksgiving dinner, right? And everything all of a sudden got really tense, and all of a sudden everybody dropped below the line, didn't they? They got very defensive and protective and guarded. 100% of the time, we were either above or below the line. And what's interesting about this is that these two conditions map to our neurology, right? I told you we'd talk about brains. Here we go. It maps to our neurology, that we have neural circuitry in our brain, neural circuitry that is triggered and activated when we're in a state of trust. And we have neural circuitry that runs in our brain that's triggered and activated when we're in a state of fear. So here we go. We're going to do our brain model. We're all going to have a working model of a brain right in front of us. If you just take your hand and hold it up and tuck your thumb in and wrap the rest of your fingers around your thumb and then bend at the wrist, boom, you have a brain. You have frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe. You have your brainstem coming down the back. That's our working model of the brain. Here on the front of your brain is what's called your prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex on the front is what is activated when you're in a state of trust, when you feel safe and secure. When you're in a state of trust, the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex is activated. And what your prefrontal cortex is responsible for, it's responsible for things like compassion, cooperation, curiosity, connection. It's responsible for our problem solving, innovative thinking, forward thinking. It's responsible for things like generosity and empathy. We tend to be more others-oriented, more capable of self-reflection when our prefrontal cortex is activated. It's where all the good stuff is that we want to have access to the most of the time. It's what allows us to have compassion not only for other people, but for ourselves. It's what allows us to be able to learn and to grow. The prefrontal cortex is like the good stuff, where we are learning to leverage our best for the best of others. The prefrontal cortex is what we want to have access to be the kinds of husbands and wives and fathers and mothers and teachers and employees and bosses, like the kind that are compassionate and encouraging, that are learning, that are generous, that know how to cooperate, to achieve common goals, like all of that stuff that allows human beings to really grow grow and develop and flourish, all of that is happening in the prefrontal cortex. That is where healthy, functioning human growth and development and movement towards our potential happens, in that prefrontal cortex. Now, if we open up our fingers to our thumb that's tucked in on the inside, that guy right there is our amygdala, and that's our emotional center of our brain. And it's that part right there that is activated when we're not in a state of trust, but when we're in a state of fear. And that amygdala is responsible for triggering our fight or flight response. That's our brain's alarm system. It's our amygdala that goes off like an alarm when we detect something in our environment that just doesn't seem right, that we sense as a threat, whether it is a threat or it's not. Our amygdala goes off and it sets off our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight system. Now, here's the really interesting thing about that part, is that when that is activated, when our amygdala is activated, when we're in a state of fear, our brain, because that part is meant to keep us alive, it's meant for our survival, that brain will divert all of our cognitive resources to fight or flight, and it takes offline everything else. When our amygdala is activated, that good stuff, that good part of our brain that's activated when we're in a state of trust, the cooperation, the generosity, the compassion, all of that goes offline when the amygdala is activated, when we're in a state of fear. And the reason is because it keeps us alive, right? You want that to happen when you're being attacked by a bear, right? We don't need to be worrying about compassion and generosity when we're being attacked by a bear. Like, we want all resources going to fight or flight. That's a good thing. However, it is not a good thing when that part of our brain is going off chronically or all the time. Or if it's being activated when there's not an actual real threat to our life present. Because what happens is the more that part of our brain becomes activated, the more sensitive that part of our brain comes to what we think are threats in our environment. It starts going off all the time. And then the stronger it gets. And you know what's happening? The stronger that part of our brain is, when that part of our brain is getting stronger and stronger, guess what's happening to the other part of our brain that we're not using because it's offline when this part's engaged? It's getting weaker, and it's getting weaker, and it's getting weaker. And that part of our brain that is responsible for compassion, for cooperation, for connection, it's starting to diminish, right? And so the more we are in a state of fear, and we really don't need to be in a state of fear, the more we lose access to the parts of our brain that are responsible for us becoming the kind of people that we all truly want to be. The less we have access to the parts of our cognition that allow us to engage and experience in our lives the way that we were all meant to. And one of the important things about this is that a lot of the things that engage that part of our brain that takes offline those really critical parts of our brain, a lot of those things we were really never meant to be afraid of to begin with. A lot of them aren't things that we're supposed to be afraid of. In fact, one of the things that neurologists are discovering is that one of the things that can determine which state we're in, whether we're above the line or we're below the line, one of the things that will determine if we find ourselves in a state of trust or a state of fear, one of the things that comes up over and over and over again is how we answer this question. What is God like? What is God like? Because all of us have some kind of response in our mind to that question. Something comes to our mind when we think about what God is like. Some kind of image or description or bullet list. We all have something that comes to mind, whether we're spiritual or not spiritual, religious or not religious. We all have some kind of conception or some kind of answer to the question, what is God like? And we develop this just over the course of our lives. Either it's what you were explicitly taught when you were a little kid and you were growing up, or it's what was exemplified to you about what God was like. A lot of times we project onto God what our relationship was like with our parents. For some of us, it's just what we learned on our own, or what we learned from a mentor, or what we learned from a community, or what we experienced in our life. But we take all of these things that we gather along the way in life, and they all feed into how we answered the question, what is God like? And what you may have noticed, maybe if you pay attention to these things the way that I do, what you may have noticed is that how we answer this question, like if it came up in a conversation, somebody said, what is God like? You have an answer that you would give. But then there's also, isn't there? There's also that reflexive, deep down way that God tends to show up in your life before you have a chance to catch yourself or correct yourself. There's a version of God, like a deep down inside of you version of God that shows up when the wheels start to fall off the cart, right? When everything starts to unravel, when you made that mistake that you said that you were never going to make and you couldn't believe the people who made those mistakes, and then you made that mistake, there's the version of God that shows up in those moments. Isn't there? And that God, that reflexive God, that God that is like deep down inside of us version of God, that God will tend to determine whether we find ourselves in a state of trust or in a state of fear. And what's so interesting to me is that when neurologists are studying, because they're looking into this, they want to know, like, how does our belief about God affect our brain and our brain development and our, just development as human beings? And what they found is that people, when they go through difficult life experiences, if the version of God that shows up is just an uncaring, detached, inattentive God, it has a tendency to put them in a state of fear. It triggers the fear response. Or when things go wrong in life, if the God that shows up in those moments is the God who caused those things, who are doing those things as a form of punishment, the response is a fear response, which undermines our state of trust and takes all of those good things in our brain offline. We become less compassionate, less connective, less generous, less creative. If when we make mistakes in our lives, when things blow up and we did that thing that we said that we'd never do, if the God that shows up is a punitive, authoritarian, shaming God, that version of God will drive us into a state of fear. If when we find ourselves around people who aren't like us, that don't believe like us, that don't look like us, if the version of God that we believe in is a God that is judgmental towards people who don't look like us or who don't believe like us, it'll actually put us into a state of fear when we're around those people. That the version of God that shows up in our lives impacts the way that our brains respond and the way that our brains develop and can minimize our access to the things that help us to become healthy, flourishing human beings. And what they've also found is that people who tend to believe in an authoritative, punitive, shaming, blaming version of God, that it actually shows increased activity in the part of the brain that is impacted by trauma. And in children and adults that believe in that version of God, if that's the version of God that shows up in your life, they've found that in children and adults, they tend to have higher rates of anxiety and depression and the physical symptoms that result from anxiety and depression because of the version of God that shows up. And on the other hand, they've also discovered that when things go wrong in life, when things start to fall apart and unravel, if the version of God that shows up is a caring, nurturing God who's like, we're going to work through this and we're going to develop something through this, it actually shifts people into a state of trust, into a mental, cognitive state that gives them access to resources that allows them to be more generous, more kind, more loving, more compassionate, more creative, all the things that we want to be. When we make mistakes, when we do the thing that we said we never do, and the version of God that shows up is a version of God who's an understanding and grace-filled and compassionate God, it actually shifts our brains into a state of trust. It gives us access to all those resources that we want to have access to as parents, as husbands, as wives. When we encounter people who are not like us, who don't believe like us, who don't think like us, who don't look like us, if the version of God that shows up in those moments is a version of God who's understanding and compassionate to people who are different from us, it shifts us. It literally shifts our cognition, our brains, our neurology into a state of trust that gives us access to the resources that allow us to become the kind of people that we want to be. And here's the really interesting thing to me, is that if we were just to say, not that we make reality whatever we want to make it, because we can't make reality whatever we want to make it, because we want to function the way that reality is. We don't want to just make reality whatever we want it to be. But if we were to make reality whatever we want it to be, and we said, what version, like if we could just make our own version of God and say, let's make the version of God that is most conducive to healthy human functioning and neurological development, that helps us to be compassionate, cooperative, creative, generous, brilliant people moving towards their potential. What version of God, if we just use like the data and the research, what version of God would we arrive at? And what if the version of God that we arrived at was the version of God that, according to Jesus' first century eyewitnesses and followers, what if it was the version of God that actually arrived? What if the version of God that is actually best for us, that heals our minds and restores us and allows for healthy human functioning and flourishing? What if the God that's actually best for us is the version of God that actually came for us? Because here's what's really, really fascinating and interesting to me. That Jesus' eyewitnesses, his first century followers who were walking around, that met Jesus, that interacted with Jesus, that spent 3 years learning from Jesus and talking with him around campfires and eating with him and listening to his teaching and asking him questions, that these followers who ended up writing accounts of Jesus' life, because how could you see the things that they saw and not write it all down? That these first century followers, it wasn't like they were walking along thinking about what kind of God could we make up that would optimize human neural development. Like, they weren't asking that question. They were just living their life. They were just fishermen. They were just hanging out until Jesus walked into their lives and onto the pages of history and changed both forever. And according to one of those eyewitnesses, a man named John, who walked with Jesus his entire 3-year ministry, who hung out, who listened to him teach, who asked him questions, spent his whole 3 years with Jesus, watched Jesus' death, resurrection, watched Jesus ascend into heaven, and 60 years later, after John had reflected on it and prayed about it and had jotted down notes and thought about, how do I put this together perfectly because I want people to know what happened, John writes an account of the life of his friend Jesus. And here's, after 60 years, I mean, think about it, like 60 years, like, how do I say this perfectly? How do I start an account to really get this across to people what happened? Here's how John starts out this account. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Go on. Here's what he says next. He says, he was with God, the Word was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. So John is making it as clear as he possibly can. Word equals God. When I say word, you think God. When I say word, you say God. Word. Word. John's like, don't miss this. Word equals God. Stay with me. I'm going somewhere with it. Because listen, the Word, God, became flesh. And he made his dwelling among us. That the God of the universe, the God who created everything, the God who created you to be like him and watched you lose sight of what he was like and become very unlike him, that God has actually become like us, that we would see what he's actually like. That God showed up, we have to get this, this is our core commitment, that God showed up in the person of Jesus to show us exactly what he is like. And John would have been like, I know, this sounds crazy. I know this sounds weird. It sounds like we're making this up. Guess what? I was just as surprised as you are. Like that God would show up with skin on to show us what he's like. Trust me, it didn't make sense to us either. For 3 years, we walked around with the guy and we didn't get it. And in fact, when you read John's account of the life of Jesus, he's very blatant and clear about this. He's like, Jesus said this. We didn't get it. Like, he said it, but we didn't get it until afterwards. This other time he told us this, and we were like, I don't know what that means. John is very clear. Like, Jesus came to show us what God is like, and they didn't get it. They weren't expecting it. Nobody was expecting it. And for Jesus' entire 3-year ministry, they didn't get it until his disciples at the very end of his ministry. And Jesus is having his last meal with the disciples. He's getting them ready for what's going to happen next. That night he's going to be betrayed, handed over to the chief priests, and they're going to turn him over to the Roman authorities who are going to crucify him. And Jesus is getting his disciples ready for his imminent departure and the fact that he's going to hand the mission over to them. And he's trying to prepare them and trying to make it clear, here's what's going to happen. Here's what I've come to do. And here's what you're going to do now. And his disciples are listening to him, and they still don't get it. It's still not clear. It's just not clicking with them that Jesus has come to show them exactly what God is like. And he's explaining it to them. He's giving them metaphors, and he's telling them stories. And you could just imagine Jesus, and there's his 12 disciples. There's Peter, and there's John, and there's Philip, and there's Thomas, and they're all sitting around. And Jesus is trying to make it so clear, and they're not getting it. And finally, one of them, named Philip, and you can feel the exasperation in Philip's voice, because you remember, I had a hard time in math. Did anybody else have a hard time in math? And the teacher would explain it 100 different ways, and it just didn't get through. And you're like, we can get that exasperation in Philip's voice. Philip finally says, he's like, Lord, show us the Father. That'll be enough for us. Like, no more stories, metaphors, parables. Stop answering our questions with better questions. Like, it's missing. We're not getting it. Just show us the Father. Can you do that? Show us the Father. That'll be enough. We can all go on and do whatever it is you're saying, but just show us the Father. And Jesus says, don't you know me, Philip? Don't you know me? Even after I've been with you, among you, such a long time, anyone, this is Jesus saying, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. To which we can imagine what Philip and the rest of the disciples are thinking. Wait, what? What? If we've seen you, we've seen the Father? That doesn't make any sense, Jesus, because we've seen you. And we've seen you welcoming sinners. And that is not the Father that we understand. That is not the Father that we've come to know. And we've seen you eating meals with tax collectors. I mean, these are the tax collectors that sold us out to the enemies who killed our relatives and our countrymen. And you were eating meals with them. That is not the Father. Jesus, just a couple minutes ago, Jesus, you were on your knees washing our feet. You're telling us that if we've seen you, we've seen the Father? Are you joking me? That doesn't compute because we've seen you. And so Jesus knows that they don't get it. They know that they don't see who the Father truly is, who Jesus has come to show exactly what God is like. And Jesus knew that within the next 24 hours, what he was going to show them about God was going to blow their minds. And to get them ready for it, Jesus says this. He says, greater love has no one than this. Jesus, come on, guys, think about this. Is there any greater love than this? To lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus, is there a greater love? What could someone do that would be a greater love than to give their... Is there anything greater that someone could do to love someone? Come on, think with me. Can you think of anything else? They're like, no. Yeah. Jesus is like, yeah. The greatest love that someone could express would be to lay down their life for their friends. And then that night, Jesus would be betrayed, he'd be arrested, he'd be put on trial and accused of blasphemy because he, Jesus, was claiming to be God. And then the religious leaders would hand him over to the Roman authorities and they would accuse him of leading an insurrection. And they'd convince the Roman authorities to have Jesus crucified. And Jesus would be beaten, he'd be spit on, he'd be mocked, and he'd be forced to carry his cross to a place where criminals were executed. And then Jesus would be nailed to a cross without lifting a finger in retaliation, without lifting a finger to resist. He allowed it to happen. And Jesus, the full revelation of God, Jesus, who if you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. Jesus hung on a cross. And just like he said he would, he died for us and meant to give us the picture of exactly what God is like. That the God who showed up is a God who didn't come demanding anything from us. A God who didn't demand sacrifice from us. A God who didn't demand our blood, but a God who came to show that if he's willing to die for us, then he is completely 100% for us. That he will never violate our freedom. He will never violate our free will, to show that he is willing to go to the greatest lengths possible to prove that he's safe. Even when we nail him to a cross, he's safe. He doesn't rise up in retaliation. He doesn't rise up in authority. He doesn't rise up in condemnation. And his invitation is for us to come close to him, that we would trust him. And Jesus' closest followers watched this, and John watched this. And after 60 years, John concluded, this is what God's like. If this is what God is like, then God is love. A self-sacrificial, unconditional, my best for your best love. And why this matters, John says, the reason that this matters is because there is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear. That the God who came in the person of Jesus is inviting us out of toxic fear that undermines human potential and our best for the best of others, and invites us into a state of trust and safety and security where human beings flourish, where we become our best for the best of others. Because fear has to do with punishment. Jesus did not come to punish. Jesus did not come to spill anybody else's blood, but to give his blood for us to prove that he is 100% all the time for us. And the one who fears has not been made perfect in love. And that word, made perfect, is the Greek word teleos. It means complete. It means whole. It means integrated. That the person who's still living in fear of God, the person who still has a mental picture of God, a God that shows up in their lives that produces fear, that person hasn't been healed. They haven't been made whole. They're not fully functioning yet because perfect love drives out fear. Listen, the version of God that's actually best for us, that produces our best healthy human functioning and flourishing is the version of God who actually came for us. It's the version of God who actually came for us. This was so clear to John. It was so clear to Jesus' first century followers. And it was so clear to a man named Paul, After Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, Paul was a Jewish leader who was persecuting followers of Jesus because he accused them of being apostates from the Jewish faith. So he was putting them in jail and putting them in prison and overseeing their execution until Paul encountered the resurrected Jesus, and Paul became a follower of Jesus and started planting Jesus communities all over the Roman Empire. And then Paul would write letters to these communities to encourage them, to guide them, to help them along. And these letters were collected and included in the New Testament portion of our Bibles. Paul's letters to these churches make up over half of the New Testament portion of our Bibles. And in one of these letters, Paul is writing to a group of followers of Jesus in a city called Colossae, and Paul is writing to them to remind them of who God is, because it's so easy for us to forget. It's so easy for us to drift in the wrong direction, to drift back to the versions of God that we are raised with or that were impressed upon us when we were younger or when we were growing up, and the version of faith that was handed to us. And Paul is trying to bring them back on course. And here's what he says. He says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ. See to it that nobody deceives you about who God is or tries to infiltrate you with different representations of who God is that are different than who God's revealed himself to be in Jesus." Paul's like, any other version of God that doesn't look like Jesus, that's hollow. That's hollow. It looks really big and magnificent and exciting and threatening and frightening on the outside, but it's hollow. It doesn't actually transform people. It doesn't actually change people, and it's deceptive. If you're believing in a version of God that doesn't look like Jesus, Paul would say, then you have the wrong version of God. If the God that you pray to doesn't look just like Jesus, that's not God, Paul would say. If the version of God that you're sacrificing to, that you're living for, that you're being obedient towards, if that version of God doesn't look just like Jesus, you've been deceived. That's not God, because God looks just like Jesus. All of that is elemental. It's elementary. It's rudimentary. It's childish, immature, babysitter versions of faith and babysitter versions of God. Paul's like, no, don't be moved by that. Because in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. Paul's like, in Jesus is God. God's come to show us exactly what he's like in the person of Jesus. Don't miss it. And in Christ, you have been brought to fullness. That when we see God as he's revealed himself in the person of Jesus, it promotes trust and safety and security. And when we're in a state of trust and safety and security, we become our best. It's just what we do. It's the most natural thing in the world for us to do. Listen, this is so good. This is so good. I included this because it's so good. What they would have responded, and Paul anticipated it, what they would have responded was, we hear you, Paul, that God looks just like Jesus. But we also know about the Old Testament and the way that God shows up in the Old Testament. And that doesn't always look like who God is in the person of Jesus. And what are we supposed to do with that? Which I think some of us who are familiar with the Old Testament and grew up with an Old Testament version of God, we have that same question. But what are we supposed to do with what we see about God in the law? And if you do, then I'll be pleased with you. But if you don't, then I won't. What, Paul? What are we supposed to do with that? Are we supposed to balance that version of God with the Jesus version of God? Are we supposed to put them together in some kind of mixed version of God? Like, what do we do with the version of God that we see portrayed in the Old Testament? And Paul says this. He says, he's referring to the law, the Old Testament, the way that God revealed himself to the nation Israel as depicted in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is the Old Testament portion of our Bible. Paul says, these are a shadow. They're a shadow. This is Paul. Paul was a Pharisee who met Jesus. Paul said, those things are a shadow of the things that were to come. If you're sitting in a room reading, sunny day, you're sitting in a room reading, and a shadow crosses you, that shadow tells you what? Somebody's there. The shadow's an indicator that someone has come in. The shadow gets your attention to the fact that there's somebody there. It's an indicator. That's what a shadow does. It indicates that somebody's coming. Paul's saying, all that stuff from before, that was a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. The reality's in Jesus. When a shadow crosses you in a room and it indicates to you that someone's coming, you don't look at the shadow to find out who it is, do you? You don't study the shadow. You don't think, oh, there's a shadow. Somebody's here. Whose shadow is that? Let's see, it kind of shaped like this. Who is that? Let me study this. You don't look at the shadow. You turn around and you look at the person because they're there, right? This is what Paul's saying. God has come in the person of Jesus. Stop looking at the shadow. The shadow was fine. It was good. It wasn't incorrect. It was just incomplete. But now it's been completed. God has shown up in the person of Jesus. Stop looking at the shadow. You can see exactly what God is like in the person of Jesus. That God has come to show us just what He is like. And the version of God that's actually best for us, as it turns out, is the version of God who actually came for us, or at least according to the eyewitnesses and the first century followers of Jesus. And so for us, we have to restore the version of God that restores us. And the version of God that restores us is the version of God that looks just like Jesus. And Jesus invites us to restore within ourselves the version of God that actually restores us. And when we follow Jesus, this is what actually gives us the guts to follow Jesus. I had to get guts in there somehow. There you go, guts. All right, back, go for it. Restore the version of God that restores you. This is why our number one core commitment as a church is our commitment to Jesus. On the face of it, it doesn't sound that surprising that a church is committed to Jesus. Big whoop. But this is why it matters so much. Because when we get that wrong, when we get mixed up about what God looks like, it actually undermines human potential. And the whole point of Jesus was God showing us just what He's like. And we are not going to back down from it because we know that it only ever undermines who God designed and created us to be. Healthy human functioning that allows us to experience and engage in life the way that God intended for us to. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. That the version of God that actually restores us is the God who actually created us. That our brains are wired to respond to the God who wired our brains. And you might not believe the whole Jesus thing. You might not buy into the whole Jesus story. But I think this at least should encourage you to look into it. Because if this could be true, wouldn't you want it to be? If it could possibly be true, wouldn't you just want that kind of God to exist? And for those of you who are followers of Jesus and have a version of God entrenched deeply within you from whatever your experiences have been growing up and learning about God, how do we restore a version of God that restores us? I'm going to do a quick strategy here. We're going to do a quick strategy here, and then we'll move on. And the strategy, like any good strategy, has an offense and a defense, right? You have to have a good offense and a good defense. How do we restore a version of God that restores us? Number one, there we go. Our offense is we're going to read and we're going to reflect. Yeah, we are. Because remember how we talked about establishing a Christ-centered worldview? And go into the next one too, and reflect. Bam. We talked about establishing a Christ-centered worldview and holistic personal disciplines. Well, we're coming back to that. The way that we establish a Christ-centered worldview is through implementing holistic personal disciplines. And one of those is reading the Bible regularly. That if we want to restore our image of a God who restores us, we need to spend time understanding this God as he's revealed in the New Testament portions of our Bibles. That there are 4 accounts of the life of Jesus written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And there are letters written by Paul that takes this version of God and says, this is how you apply this to your regular life in the first century. This is what it looks like to live out the love that Jesus is inviting us into. So we highly encourage everyone to spend time in the revelation of who God is in the Bible, reading about Jesus to restore that image of the God who restores us. And the second thing to do is just to reflect. Spend 5 to 10 minutes every day just quietly reflecting on who God's revealed himself to be in the person of Jesus. Just reflecting on God, allowing the version of God that's revealed himself in the person of Jesus to speak in to our circumstances, to encourage us, to remind us of who he is and how he feels about us. Now, actually, what neurologists have discovered is that just 5 to 10 minutes per day of reflecting on a loving and compassionate God for 8 weeks, you see increased activity, guess where? In the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that is responsible for our compassion, our creativity, our curiosity, our cooperation, our others-orientedness. That grows and develops the more we reflect on a God of love and compassion. Go figure. That's the offense. Read and reflect. Now some defense. And our defense, this is what we do when the other version of God shows up. When the wheels fall off the cart, when our life starts to spiral, and we find a version of God showing up in our heads, in our minds, in the language that we use to talk to ourselves that doesn't look like Jesus, the number one thing we're going to do is just develop awareness. Just notice it. Just notice it. Notice when that God shows up. Notice when God starts accusing you. When you notice that God starts shaming you, that should be an indicator. When you find yourself shifting below the line into a state of fear, that's an indicator that another version of God is showing up. I'm encouraging you, just become aware. Just notice it. Number one, just notice it, become aware. Number two, just acknowledge it. Like, there he is again. There's that distorted version of God. Just acknowledge. Acknowledge that that God that's showing up isn't the God. There's a distortion. Number three, allow the God who exists to accept you right there. Instead of shaming and guilting yourself that you haven't fixed your version of God, that old version of God, the deceptive version of God, the deception is still showing up, instead of beating yourself up about that, allow the God who actually is just to pull you close and accept you. Just acknowledge when that God shows up. Just be aware of it. Just acknowledge it and allow the God who is to pull you in close and accept you right where you are. Thank you guys so much for this evening. The way I want to close out this evening is I just want to close with a visualization. Sharisa is going to play just a little music behind it just to help us with it. But I just want to invite you guys we're going to rehearse what it looks like to have awareness, acknowledgement, and acceptance, just all of us together, so we know what that looks like, what that feels like, so that we can restore in ourselves the version of God that restores us. I'm going to invite everybody just to close your eyes. And I'm going to invite you just to become aware, in a completely non-judgmental, non-critical way, just to become aware of the version of God that's showing up in your life. Maybe it's around difficult circumstances. Maybe it's around something that came up in your life that you didn't see coming. Maybe it's the way that God shows up around your current failures. The harsh, the critical, accusatory God whose standards are so high for you. The version of God that just won't let you get away from those past mistakes. version of God is showing up in your life right now. Just become aware. Just become aware of that God showing up. I'm going to invite you to just acknowledge. Just imagine looking at that punitive, blaming, shaming God from a distance and say, yep, he's showing up again. And just acknowledge it. There he is. That's the distortion right there. That's not him. That's not who God is. That's not the God who's come for me. And just imagine yourself backing away from that God. That God, maybe you spent a lot of time close to that God, serving that God, feeling beat down and oppressed, trying to please that God. Just imagine yourself backing away from that God. And as you do, imagine yourself just bumping into the God who revealed himself in the person of Jesus, who was always there all along, who never left your side, who never walked away from you. Just imagine him just embracing you and saying, yeah, that's not me. That's not me. I'm here. I'm for you. I'm your biggest fan. Oh, you've gone through some hard things. I'm so proud of you. Oh, I'm here for you. Just come close to me. Just be close to me and hear me remind you again that I love you and I am for you. Father, we are so thankful for who you are, and for who you've revealed yourself to be to us in the version of Jesus. Help us to restore in our minds and our hearts and our souls the version of you that restores us, the God who's come. In Jesus, we love you and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. Oh, they're still working the kinks out of me. But we're all above the line here. Every Sunday here at Key City Church, we practice what's often called communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. And what this is just a practice in which we remember Jesus' death on the cross for us. It has, over the past 2,000 years, been practiced by all followers of Jesus across all cultures and all languages. All races have practiced this. You don't have to be a member of Key City Church to practice this with us, but if you are a follower of Jesus, we invite you to. And Paul wrote to followers of Jesus in Corinth, explaining this practice to them because it was something that his earliest followers practiced. And Paul reminded them that the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body given for you because I'm a God for you." And Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." So let's take the wafer together in remembrance of Jesus. In the same way, Paul says, after dinner, Jesus took the cup and Jesus said, This is the blood of the new covenant. This is my blood given for you. the blood of the new covenant, that Jesus hadn't come to continue, but he'd come to do something brand new, to extend grace and establish trust that produces transformation. And Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. Let's drink together. Will you guys pray with me one more time? And Jesus, we are just so thankful for you that you saw fit to come and show us the extent of your love for us. That love was meant to drive out the fear that has so often become rooted in our hearts because of our misperceptions of who you are. Let this remind us, once again, remind us afresh. We never outgrow the need to be reminded of your love for us. Let us be reminded throughout the coming week that you are a God who is for us, that we would experience the trust that results from that. We love you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.